Right now, the federal government is draining a reservoir in Wyoming on purpose to keep a dam 400 miles away in Utah from failing. Not a metaphor. In order to pull up to 1 million acre-feet out of Flaming Gorge, because Lake Powell is weeks from the elevation where Glen Canyon Dam can no longer even generate power. Officials are calling this protection. The state engineer is calling it a trap with no exit. And almost nobody is asking the one question that actually matters most here. What happens the next time this exact math shows up again? I work around reservoir operations and interstate water law, and I want to be precise here, because the numbers are the whole story, and the story gets worse the closer you look at it. The public version goes like this. Drought hit the Colorado River. Lake Powell got low. The Bureau of Reclamation stepped in, moved some water around, problem managed, everybody breathes easier. That is the version that fits neatly into a press release. It is not wrong exactly, it is just missing almost everything that makes this dangerous. And I mean that literally. Structurally dangerous, not dangerous in a vague headline sense. Here's the detail nobody puts in the actual headline. Flaming Gorge was sitting at about 83% capacity when this order came down. Not empty, not in crisis, a reservoir that, on paper, looked completely fine. And the fix for somebody else's emergency 400 miles downstream was to take up to 1 million acre-feet out of a reservoir that wasn't the one in trouble. That should bother you a little. It genuinely bothers me, professionally, in a way a clean press release was never going to capture. And before we even get to the mechanics, understand the scale of what's riding on this. The Colorado River supplies municipal water to roughly 40 million people. It supports over 8 billion kilowatt hours of hydropower a year, enough to run about 700,000 homes, and it sustains something like 5.5 million acres of farmland. When people say Lake Powell is the system's backup, they're not exaggerating for drama. This is genuinely load-bearing infrastructure for a huge chunk of the western United States, and it's being managed, right now, one emergency draw at a time. And this isn't a one summer squeeze either. The Colorado River has been in what hydrologists openly call a megadrought since roughly the turn of the century, more than 2 decades of below-average flows, with a few wet years scattered in that made everyone briefly relax before the next disappointing snowpack put us right back here. Every time there's a decent winter, the public conversation quietly resets to crisis averted. Every time the snowpack underperforms, we rediscover the same vulnerabilities, as if nobody had written any of it down the last time around. So let's talk about why Lake Powell needed saving in the first place, because this was not random, and it is absolutely not new. Glen Canyon Dam runs on elevation, not water volume in some abstract sense, elevation, an exact number on a gauge. Above 3,490 feet, water gets pushed through 8 pressurized penstocks into turbines, and that's how you get hydropower for a good chunk of the western grid. Below 3,490 feet, you lose the penstocks entirely. The only thing left is the river outlet works, 4 smaller pipes near the base of the dam that were never built to carry the entire load by themselves. Reclamation has said this in plain language. Those outlets were designed for flood control and short experimental releases, bursts, not for keeping a river alive full-time, year after year. And below that line is a second one, 3,370 feet, dead pool. Below dead pool, water can't leave the dam by gravity at all. It just sits there, stranded, useless to everyone downstream, no matter how much of it is technically still in the lake. So when I hear officials say Lake Powell was projected to drop below 3,490 by August, I don't hear a scheduling problem. I hear a countdown to the point where the entire dam runs exclusively on plumbing. It was never designed to run on exclusively. Here's a number that made this feel real to me. A hydrologist at Utah State, Jack Schmidt, has pointed out that Lake Powell's live storage, the water that can actually flow by gravity through the dam's tunnels, has never dropped below roughly 5.26 million acre-feet since the reservoir was first created in the early 1960s. This summer, storage was already closing in on that historic floor, and by his own accounting, the lake was losing something like 4,800 acre-feet of water a day just since the start of June. Reservoir operations, he said, get very complicated once elevation drops below 3,500 feet and live storage drops below 4.3 million acre-feet. Complicated is doing a lot of quiet work in that sentence. What he means is that below those lines, the margin for error basically disappears. And here's the part that should have made headlines and didn't. Those exact outlet pipes have documented damage. Cavitation, coating loss, pipe wall wear, first observed back in 1965. 60 years of a known weakness in the one system you'd be forced to lean on completely if the water drops far enough. That's not a hypothetical risk somebody dreamed up this year for dramatic effect. That's a maintenance history, on paper, with a date attached. So the emergency plan for saving Glen Canyon Dam runs, at the low end, through equipment with a 6-decade injury record. Sit with that for a second, okay? That's the part that actually keeps me up. Back to Flaming Gorge, because this is where it gets worse, not better. This was not Flaming Gorge's first big draw. The reservoir went into this round already low, sitting around 6,024 feet instead of its historic high near 6,040 feet, because it hadn't fully recovered from the last emergency pull before this one arrived. That's the Wyoming State Engineer's own account, not mine. Brandon Gebhardt and his staff have been saying for months that Flaming Gorge can act as backup this year, but every time you drain it, you weaken its ability to do the same job again next year, or the year after that. Read that back. The tool they're using to rescue Lake Powell is a tool that gets less useful every single time you use it, and there is currently no committed, published plan to let it recover before the next call comes in. That is not a backup system. That is a rechargeable battery that nobody is bothering to charge. And it gets more specific than that, because reclamation did not reach for every reservoir in the basin equally. Blue Mesa in Colorado and Navajo Reservoir in New Mexico, both part of the same original Colorado River storage project as Glen Canyon and Flaming Gorge, were left alone this time, specifically because their own levels are already too low to safely tap. So the backup system for the entire upper basin has effectively narrowed down to one reservoir on the Wyoming-Utah line. Because the other candidates already failed the same test, Flaming Gorge is currently failing. That is not 4 reservoirs sharing a burden. That is one reservoir absorbing what used to be spread across 4, quietly, without much of a public conversation about what that concentration actually means long term. Now here's a document that turns this from a bad look into something closer to an admission. In 2023, 4 states, Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, and Wyoming, sat down through the Upper Colorado River Commission and put their support for these emergency releases in writing, with conditions attached. 3 of them specifically. Water sent to help Lake Powell has to be repaid once Flaming Gorge fully recovers. These releases cannot be used to justify sending more water downstream to the lower basin than would have happened anyway. And the maneuver can never leave Lake Powell worse off than if nobody had intervened at all. Read that 3rd condition again, slowly. Cannot leave Lake Powell worse off than doing nothing. And their own resolution states, in plain language, that this outcome happened anyway. That is not me interpreting a vague quote generously in one direction. That is the state's own document conceding that the fix, exactly as designed, failed its own stated test. I genuinely do not know how you read that sentence and still call this routine operational housekeeping. I cannot do it. I have tried. So let us slow down on the outlet works for a second, because I think people hear there is a backup pipe system and assume that automatically means the problem is solved as long as those pipes physically exist. This is where the technology fit question comes in, and I want to be fair here, because this isn't a story about fake infrastructure or some kind of scam. The river outlet works are legitimate engineering. They do a real job, and they've done it for decades. The problem is, the job they were scoped for and the job they're now being quietly asked to do are not the same job at all. They were built for short, controlled, high-flow releases. Flood events. Experimental flows meant to mimic natural floods for the Grand Canyon ecosystem downstream. Bursts, not marathons. Now they're being positioned, in practice, if not in official language, as the fallback plan for sustained low-elevation operation, potentially stretching across years, on a dam that was built between 1956 and 1964 with an entirely different water reality in mind, one that assumed a wetter, more reliable river than the one that actually shows up now. That's the pattern I keep seeing in water systems that fail publicly, over and over, in different states, with different names attached. Nobody swaps in a fake fix. They take a real piece of infrastructure and quietly ask it to do a job it was never sized for, and then everyone acts surprised when the wear shows up faster than the original engineers expected. You cannot engineer your way out of a scale problem using equipment built for a completely different scale. The water does not care how confident the press release sounds. Now, the monitoring gap, because this is the part that actually worries me more than the raw elevation numbers. The public messaging around this entire situation reads as proactive. Reclamation stepping in, managing the system, protecting the dam before things get worse. But look closely at the actual sequence of events. The extra draw from Flaming Gorge got ordered because Lake Powell was already projected to fall below the critical elevation by August. That is reactive. That is moving water only after the crisis line is already visible on the horizon, not before it. And there is still no public recovery framework for Flaming Gorge itself. Not we're studying options. Not here is the specific threshold at which we stop pulling from this reservoir. Just an open-ended arrangement where the reservoir gives up water whenever Powell needs it, and nobody has committed, in writing, to what happens to Flaming Gorge's own recovery timeline in exchange. That's a monitoring gap, and I don't mean a missing sensor bobbing somewhere in a lake. I mean an entire basin-scale management gap, where one reservoir's long-term health is treated as expendable in service of another reservoir's short-term emergency, with no agreed mechanism anywhere for actually balancing the two against each other. Here's why that should worry you even if you've never set foot near either reservoir. This is not the last time this exact scenario plays out. This is a pattern with a trigger, and the trigger is going to fire again, probably sooner than anyone in a press release wants to admit right now. And think about what's actually sitting downstream of a miscalculation here. Glen Canyon Power Plant runs 8 generators, over 1 million kilowatts of total capacity between them. That's not a rounding error on a regional grid. That's real load serving real customers. If these releases underperform, or if the outlet works take on damage faster than the maintenance history suggests they might, the fallback conversation isn't "we'll figure it out." It's reduced generation, uncertain deliveries for downstream water users, and a scramble that gets managed in real time instead of planned for in advance. Nobody wants to say that plainly in a press release. So instead, you get the word protective, over and over, doing a lot of quiet reassurance work. Let's talk about who actually feels this first, because it isn't an abstraction sitting in a spreadsheet somewhere. Tony Valdez runs a marina at Flaming Gorge. He's watched the ramp down to his own dock drop into a sharp, steep angle as the water pulls back month after month, to the point where he's now rebuilding walkways and seriously weighing whether to relocate the entire marina at what he calls an astronomical cost. Reclamation itself has confirmed the water level there will fall a total of about 35 feet by next April. 35 feet is not a scenic inconvenience you shrug off. That's a business, a livelihood, a piece of a small town's economy getting quietly reshaped by a decision made to protect a dam sitting in a different state entirely. Boating access is expected to shrink earlier in the season than normal, according to Reclamation's own statements. Downstream, in the Grand Canyon, lower flow rates are expected to affect rafting conditions and make fishing noticeably harder. None of that shows up cleanly in a headline about acre-feet and elevation charts. It shows up in somebody's income, somebody's dock, somebody's summer season getting shorter than it used to be. And Valdez said something that I think is the single most honest line in this entire story. He said you could drain every lake in the system and still never achieve enough supply to satisfy the underlying demand. That's not despair talking. That's someone standing on his own collapsing ramp who understands the actual math better than most official statements ever bother to. Somebody, somewhere, is going to end up paying for those new walkways, and it almost certainly won't be the agency that ordered the drawdown in the first place. It'll be a marina owner, or a local tax base, or a small town's tourism season, absorbing a cost that started as a line item in a basin-wide operations memo 400 miles away. That's how accountability tends to work in these stories. The decision gets made at the top of the system, and the bill lands at the bottom of it, on a dock, in real dollars, for real people. I'll say this too, because it's true, and it's a little absurd. The sun coming up over that reservoir every summer is not going anywhere. The demand on that water is not going anywhere either. You can write as many careful press releases as you want, and the water is still going to behave exactly like water, responding to elevation, gravity, and arithmetic, and completely ignoring whatever adjective got used to describe the plan. Because here's the real root of this, and it's older than any single reservoir involved in this whole mess. The Colorado River is governed today by an allocation framework that traces back to 1922, built on flow assumptions from a noticeably wetter period than what the river has actually produced for decades now. States have known this for a long time. Reclamation has known it. The engineering community has known it. What we're watching right now with Flaming Gorge and Lake Powell isn't a freak, once-in-a-lifetime drought event. It is a 100-year-old paper agreement finally running out of water to paper over. There's even a version of this fight happening inside Wyoming itself, and it's worth sitting with for a second. As Lake Powell edges closer to what water managers bluntly call dead pool, the point where water simply can't flow downriver at all, some Wyoming officials are bracing for even heavier demand on Flaming Gorge going forward. State Senator Larry Hicks has pointed out that in a true dead pool scenario, irrigation rights legally outrank hydropower generation. Power generation matters, he said, but it isn't as important as protecting people's actual livelihoods. That's not a talking point invented for this video. That's a real fault line sitting quietly underneath every calm press release about managing the system. That's why I keep pushing back on the word emergency every single time officials reach for it here. An emergency is something you genuinely did not see coming. This is a math problem that multiple states have been formally negotiating around since at least 2023, when they wrote down explicit conditions for exactly this kind of release, because they already expected it to happen again, probably repeatedly. Notice too how the public framing quietly shifts responsibility. Drought forced our hand sounds like weather did this to everyone equally, like nobody could have planned around it. But drought is the input, the output, the specific choice to drain one particular reservoir instead of spreading the load, or renegotiating the underlying allocation, or building in a mandatory recovery period. That output is a management decision, made by people, on a timeline, with alternatives on the table that didn't get chosen. Calling that the drought's fault is technically not false. It's also not the whole sentence. It's the part of the sentence that's easiest to say out loud in front of a camera. So let's talk about what a genuinely competent basin-wide water manager would actually want in this situation. Because it is not more emergency draws announced one reservoir at a time. It's a real recovery timeline for Flaming Gorge, published and binding, not implied through a state engineer's public comments. It's transparent trigger points, agreed on well in advance, for exactly when a reservoir like Flaming Gorge gets tapped again, instead of decisions announced only after the crisis line is already uncomfortably close. It's a genuine renegotiation of the underlying compact math itself, because you cannot manage a modern river using flow assumptions written for a wetter century and expect a clean, sustainable outcome every single time you roll the dice. And it's honest public communication that stops using the word protective for decisions that a state's own signed resolution admits left the supposedly protected reservoir worse off than doing nothing at all. None of that is radical. That is baseline professional water management, the kind you'd expect from any competently run system. Think about how a well-run municipal utility handles an aging pipe network. You don't wait for a main to burst and then hold a press conference about how quickly you responded. You track pipe age, you set replacement thresholds, you budget for it years in advance, and when something does fail, it's treated as a data point that updates the plan, not a surprise that resets the conversation back to zero. Basin-wide reservoir management should work the same way. Instead, what we're watching is closer to running a hospital on walk-in emergencies only, no scheduled checkups, no preventive care, just triage every time a number crosses a line that everyone involved already knew was coming. The fact that a real recovery plan doesn't fully exist yet, after multiple rounds of this exact crisis playing out on a loop, is the actual scandal here. Not the drought itself. The drought is real, and nobody's disputing that. The scandal is the gap between what the system is capable of planning for and what it's actually choosing to plan for. I want to be fair about one more thing before I land this. because I don't want to overstate what's actually happening. Nobody in this particular story is lying to you outright. Reclamation's elevation numbers are real. The thresholds are real. The 35-foot projection at Flaming Gorge is real and publicly documented. This isn't a story about fabricated data or some kind of deliberate cover-up in the classic sense. It's a story about a system that keeps choosing the fastest available fix over the fix that would actually hold. Because the fast fix is the one you can announce confidently in a press release this quarter. And the real fix requires reopening a 100-year-old agreement that nobody currently in office particularly wants to touch. That is the pattern. That is, frankly, always the pattern in stories like this one. Treat the visible symptom, protect the current operating schedule, and quietly push the actual structural problem further downstream, literally downstream in this case, to whichever reservoir happens to still have enough water sitting in it to absorb the hit. So where does this actually leave things right now as of this recording? Lake Powell's elevation is expected to climb back up toward 3,500 feet by next spring, assuming these releases perform exactly as modeled. That will get treated publicly as a clear win. Officials will say the system responded the way it was supposed to, and on paper, narrowly, it will have. But walk through what actually changed, physically, on the ground, once the celebratory numbers get announced. Glen Canyon Dam is still the same concrete structure poured between 1956 and 1964. The river outlet works still carry the same cavitation damage first logged in 1965, just one more year older than before. The 1922 compact still assumes a volume of water the river hasn't reliably delivered in decades. And Flaming Gorge, the reservoir that just absorbed the entire burden alone because Blue Mesa and Navajo couldn't take any of it, will be sitting roughly 35 feet lower than where it started this year, with still no binding recovery plan attached to it, quietly waiting for the next year the numbers get tight again. And they will get tight again. They always do. On this river, on this schedule. Nothing structural gets fixed by a good winter or a well-timed emergency draw. The compact still assumes water that stopped reliably showing up decades ago, and simply moving that shortage from one reservoir to another doesn't make the underlying shortage disappear. It just decides, year by year, whose dock is going to be sitting at the steeper angle this time. Right now, that's Tony Valdez's. Next time, it might not be. But there will be a next time, and there will be somebody's ramp.